October 14th, 1902. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. When Detective James Halloran forced open the basement door of Matthias Werner's taxidermy shop on South Street, the smell hit him first. Not the chemical preservatives he expected. Something else. Something that made his 20 years on the force suddenly feel inadequate. The afternoon light filtered through dirty basement windows, illuminating rows of preserved animals on wooden shelves. Cats, dogs, even a few exotic birds. Werner's work was renowned throughout Philadelphia's wealthy districts. Grieving pet owners paid handsomely to have their beloved companions preserved for eternity. But when Halloran lifted a particularly large German Shepherd mount from its pedestal, the weight was wrong. The distribution was off. He'd seen enough taxidermy to know that something inside this dog shouldn't be there. What he found when he carefully cut through the stitching would ignite the most sensational criminal investigation in Philadelphia's history. Inside the preserved animal hide was something that had once been human, a child's arm, carefully dissected and positioned to give the mount its realistic shape. This wasn't taxidermy. This was a tomb, but the truth was far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. Before we uncover the horrifying truth about Matthias Werner and his House of Horrors, make sure to subscribe to Fierce Sermon and ring that notification bell. We're diving deep into one of the most disturbing cases of the Edwardian era, a story that's been buried in Philadelphia's archives for over a century. Drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers around the world. Philadelphia in 1902 stood at the crossroads of 2 centuries. The city that had birthed American independence now found itself grappling with the violent growing pains of the modern age. Horse-drawn carriages shared cobblestone streets with the occasional sputtering automobile. Gas lamps were slowly giving way to electric streetlights. The population had swelled to over 1.3 million souls, making it the 3rd largest city in America. But with progress came darkness. The city's rapid industrialization had created stark divisions between the wealthy elite of Rittenhouse Square and the teeming immigrant neighborhoods that surrounded the factories. Children as young as 8 worked 12-hour shifts in textile mills. The death rate in working-class districts was staggering, particularly among children under 5. When a poor family lost a child, which happened with tragic frequency, there was rarely money for a proper burial. Bodies sometimes disappeared into unmarked graves or were sold to medical schools for dissection practice. This was the world where Matthias Werner had built his reputation. South Street in 1902 existed in a peculiar middle ground. Not quite respectable, not entirely disreputable. Small shops lined the thoroughfare, tailors, cobblers, importers of exotic goods. Werner's Taxidermy and Natural Preservation occupied a narrow 3-story building at number 847, distinguished by its large plate glass window displaying his work. Werner himself seemed the very picture of respectability. 43 years old, he had immigrated from Bavaria in 1889 with impeccable credentials from European natural history museums. He wore round spectacles that gave him a scholarly air. His shop was immaculate. His manners, when dealing with clients, were refined and sympathetic, qualities that grieving pet owners found enormously comforting. Mr. Werner understood our pain, Mrs. Abigail Thornton, a mainline socialite, told the Philadelphia Inquirer in 1901. When our beloved Prince passed away, Mr. Werner treated him with such reverence. He returned Prince to us looking as if he were merely sleeping. The wealthy flocked to Werner's shop, in an era when pet-keeping was becoming increasingly popular among the upper classes, a sign of refinement and sentiment. The ability to preserve a beloved animal indefinitely held enormous appeal. Werner charged premium prices, $15 for a cat, 25% for a small dog, 50% or more for larger breeds. In an era when a factory worker earned perhaps $10 a week, these were extraordinary sums. But Werner's business model had a problem. Proper taxidermy required specific materials, glass eyes, wooden forms, special waxes, and most importantly, tow, the fiber stuffing that gave mounts their shape. These materials were expensive. The profit margins, even at Werner's elevated prices, were thinner than his wealthy clients imagined. Werner needed a cheaper way to fill his mounts. He needed something that was readily available, that cost him nothing, that would never be missed. And he found it, what his clients didn't know, what they couldn't have imagined, was that Werner had developed a secondary specialty. He had quietly built relationships with several of Philadelphia's most destitute neighborhoods. In the narrow alleys of Southwark and the crowded tenements near the docks, Werner was known for his unusual charity. When a poor family's child died, Werner would sometimes offer to handle the remains, free of charge, a Christian kindness he called it, a final dignity for those who could afford nothing. Grieving parents, desperate and grateful, asked no questions about what happened to their children's bodies afterward. Escalating incidents. The first sign that something was wrong came in March of 1901, 17 months before the final discovery. Dr. Samuel Ashford, a physician with the Pennsylvania hospital, received an unusual request. A patient named Catherine Doyle, a washerwoman from the 4th Ward, had come to him in considerable distress. Her 11-year-old son Thomas had died of pneumonia 3 weeks earlier. A kind gentleman, a taxidermist, she said, had offered to provide burial services at no cost. She'd been grateful. But now she was troubled by dreams. She wanted to know where her son was buried, wanted to visit the grave. Dr. Ashford made inquiries. The taxidermist was Matthias Werner. But when Ashford visited Werner's shop to ask about the burial location, Werner's response was smooth and practiced. The boy had been interred at Mount Moriah Cemetery, he said, in the Potter's Field section. The records were sometimes imprecise for charity burials. Many bodies shared common graves. Ashford, convinced by Werner's specificity and apparent sincerity, assured Mrs. Doyle that her son rested in consecrated ground. He never followed up. He never checked the cemetery records. In August of 1901, another incident raised concerns. Briefly, a delivery man named Patrick Keene was bringing supplies to Werner's shop late one evening. Werner typically received deliveries during business hours, but he'd sent word requesting this particular shipment be brought after dark. Special materials, the message had said. Discretion required. Keene arrived at 8:30. The shop was closed, but light glowed from the basement windows. He knocked on the rear door. When Werner answered, Keene caught a glimpse of the basement behind him. What he saw troubled him enough that he later spoke to a police officer at his local tavern. There was a child on the table, Keene told Officer Thomas Brandt. I swear it. Laid out like he was working on it, like it was one of his animals. But when Brandt asked follow-up questions, Keene's story became less certain. Maybe it was a large dog? The light was dim. Werner worked on all sizes of creatures. And what reason would a taxidermist have to? No, Keene decided. He must have been mistaken. Too much drink before the delivery, perhaps. Brandt filed no report. The incident that should have ended everything came in February of 1902. A fire broke out in the building next to Werner's shop. The blaze was contained quickly, but smoke had seeped into Werner's basement through the shared wall. When firefighters entered to check for structural damage, they found Werner's workroom in disarray. The taxidermist had clearly left in a hurry. Firefighter Lieutenant Jacob Crest noticed something odd among the smoke and chemicals. In the corner, partially covered by a tarp, was what appeared to be human bones, small bones, a child's rib cage. Crest reported it to his captain, who examined the remains. The captain, a man named Walsh with 15 years of experience, made a decision that would later haunt him. These were animal bones, he concluded, probably from a deer or large dog. Taxidermists worked with all manner of skeletons as reference materials. Nothing to concern the police about, but Walsh had noticed something else that troubled him enough to make a note in his personal journal, an entry that would later become evidence at trial. The bones were not simply skeletal remains. They showed evidence of careful dissection, deliberate dismemberment. The cuts were too precise, too purposeful. This was not the work of decay or animals. Someone had taken great care in separating these bones from their flesh. Walsh convinced himself that Werner must be practicing his craft on animal remains. He convinced himself there was a rational explanation. He did not contact the police. Throughout 1902, other small signs accumulated. A mortician named David Rosen mentioned to colleagues that Werner seemed unusually interested in acquiring bodies from poor families, even offering to pay small fees for the privilege. A janitor at the Medical College of Pennsylvania reported seeing Werner in conversation with a known resurrection man, grave robbers who supplied medical schools with cadavers for dissection practice. But these incidents remained disconnected. Philadelphia was a large city. Communication between districts was limited. No one saw the pattern emerging because no one could see all the pieces. Then came October 14, 1902. The case that finally brought Detective Halloran to Werner's door began with a missing girl named Mary Keegan. She was 9 years old, the daughter of Irish immigrants who lived in a tenement on Fitzwater Street. Mary had disappeared on her way home from the button factory where she worked alongside her mother. The Keegans were frantic, but Mary wasn't the first child to disappear from the neighborhood that year. Two others, siblings named Joseph and Anna Lombardi, ages 7 and 5, had vanished in July while playing near the docks. The police had assumed they'd fallen into the Delaware River. Their bodies were never recovered. What connected these cases was something Halloran discovered almost by accident. Matthias Werner had visited all three families in the months before the disappearances. He'd been asking about children who were sick or recently deceased, ostensibly as part of his charitable burial work. This pattern, once noticed, demanded investigation. When Halloran and two other detectives arrived at 847 South Street on that October afternoon, Werner was cordial. He permitted the search willingly. He had nothing to hide, he assured them. His charitable work was entirely legitimate. He could provide documentation. But Werner made one critical mistake. When Halloran asked to search the basement workroom, Werner hesitated. Just for a moment, just long enough. Halloran saw that hesitation. And he knew. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button right now. What Detective Halloran was about to discover would shock Philadelphia society to its core and expose one of the most grotesque criminal enterprises in American history. Share this with someone who loves dark mysteries. Let's discover what happens next. The basement of 847 South Street measured approximately 30 feet by 20 feet. Wooden shelves lined 3 walls, floor to ceiling. The 4th wall held Werner's work table, a massive oak surface stained dark with chemicals in use. Preserved animals filled every available space. Cats in lifelike poses, dogs frozen mid-stride, birds with wings spread in eternal flight. Detective Halloran counted 47 mounted specimens in that basement. 47 testaments to Werner's skill. When he began examining them more closely, systematic and thorough, he noticed inconsistencies. Some of the mounts were heavier than they should be. Some had unusual proportions, bodies that seemed fuller, limbs that seemed too thick. The German Shepherd was the first. Halloran lifted it from its pedestal. The weight was immediately wrong. At least 20 pounds heavier than a properly mounted dog of that size should be. He carried it to Werner's work table, and using one of the taxidermist's own knives, carefully cut through the stitching along the mount's belly. The stuffing inside should have been toe or excelsior. Instead, Halloran found himself staring at what he initially couldn't process. Bones. Human bones. A child's forearm still articulated, the small hand intact with all its fingers. "Mother of God," whispered Officer Frank Morrison, who had followed Halloran down the stairs. But that was only the beginning. Over the next 3 hours, as more officers arrived and methodically opened mount after mount, the true scope of Werner's horror revealed itself. The large mounts, dogs primarily, contained the most substantial remains. Limbs, torso sections, even complete spinal columns. The smaller animals, cats, foxes, contained hands, feet, sections of ribcage. By evening, the basement floor was covered with the open carcasses of Werner's work. And inside those carcasses lay the dismembered remains of at least 18 children. Dr. William Osler, the renowned physician from Johns Hopkins who was consulting in Philadelphia at the time, was brought to the scene to examine the remains. His report, preserved in the Philadelphia Police Archives, reads with clinical precision. The human remains discovered within the taxidermied animals show evidence of expert anatomical knowledge. The dismemberment was accomplished with surgical precision. Joints were disarticulated properly. Soft tissue was removed cleanly. Whoever performed this work understood human anatomy at a level suggesting medical training or extensive experience with cadaver dissection. The bodies appear to range in age from approximately 4 to 12 years. The preservation state varies, suggesting the remains were acquired over an extended period, perhaps as long as 3 to 4 years. But it was Dr. Osler's final observation that proved most chilling. What disturbs me most is not the dismemberment itself, grim as that is, but the care taken in positioning the remains within the animal mounts. The limbs were arranged to provide structural support. The bones were positioned to create realistic weight distribution. This was not the frenzied work of a madman. This was methodical, purposeful. The deceased children were being used as components, as materials, in Werner's professional work. The investigation of the shop itself revealed Werner's record-keeping system. He was meticulous. A leather-bound ledger documented every mount he'd created since 1898. Each entry included the client's name, the type of animal, the fee charged, and, most horrifyingly, a notation in German indicating which materials had been used. The German annotations used coded language, but their meaning became clear. KM arm leg meant a child with those initials had provided those specific components. TD full torso indicated more extensive use of a particular victim. Cross-referencing Werner's ledger with missing persons reports and death certificates from poor neighborhoods revealed the pattern. At least 23 children had died or disappeared whose families had contact with Werner. The mounted animals in the basement contained 18 identifiable sets of remains. That left 5 unaccounted for. Where were the rest? Detective Halloran ordered the entire building searched. In the third-floor apartment where Werner lived, officers found additional documentation, correspondence with other taxidermists, inquiries about techniques, complaints about the rising cost of materials, but they also found something else. Hidden behind a false panel in Werner's bedroom closet was a wooden box containing photographs. The photographs showed children, both living and deceased, in various stages of Werner's process. The images were clinical, documentary in nature, but their existence suggested Werner was not merely solving a business problem. He was documenting his work, perhaps even taking pride in it. The discovery that finally broke even hardened detectives' composure came when officers excavated Werner's small backyard garden. Buried in shallow graves were the skeletal remains of 5 more children, the ones whose bodies had been too small, too damaged, or otherwise unsuitable for Werner's purposes. 23 children. 23 families who had trusted a seemingly kind stranger with their most vulnerable moments of grief. Investigation aftermath. Matthias Werner was arrested at his sister's home in Germantown on October 15, 1902, one day after the discovery. He had fled there immediately, apparently hoping the investigation would somehow overlook the evidence. When Detective Halloran and 4 officers arrived, Werner offered no resistance. His only words during the arrest were, "I meant them no disrespect. They were already dead. I gave them purpose." The statement would become infamous. Werner's trial began on January 12, 1903, in Philadelphia's Court of Common Pleas. District Attorney George Stuart Graham personally prosecuted the case, understanding its significance for Philadelphia's reputation. The city's newspapers had been publishing lurid details for months. The national press had picked up the story. Philadelphia, the birthplace of American liberty, was now known for producing one of the most grotesque criminals in the nation's history. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. The physical evidence alone, 23 sets of remains, Werner's ledger, the photographs, would have been sufficient. But Graham went further. He called 43 witnesses over 3 weeks. Parents testified through tears. Catherine Doyle, whose son Thomas had been among the first victims identified, collapsed on the witness stand when shown a photograph of the dog mount that had contained her child's arm. The courtroom had to be cleared. Medical experts explained Werner's methodology in clinical detail. Dr. Osler testified that Werner had likely acquired his anatomical knowledge through unofficial work with medical schools or through apprenticeship with European taxidermists who had access to anatomical specimens. The dismemberment patterns showed professional competence. Perhaps most damning was the testimony of Werner's own suppliers. Several merchants who had sold him materials testified that Werner had dramatically reduced his orders for conventional taxidermy stuffing beginning in late 1898. His purchase records showed he was buying only about a quarter of the toe and excelsior that his volume of work should have required. He'd found a cheaper alternative. The defense, led by attorney Marcus Brennan, faced an impossible task. Brennan's strategy was to argue insanity, that no rational person could commit such acts. Therefore, Werner must be legally insane and should be committed to an asylum rather than executed. The defense called psychiatrists who testified about Werner's childhood in Bavaria, about possible head injuries, about his social isolation. They painted a picture of a man disconnected from normal moral reasoning, incapable of understanding the enormity of his actions. But the prosecution's rebuttal was devastating. They presented Werner's business records showing clear financial motivation. They showed his coded ledger entries proving he understood his actions were criminal. Why else use code? They demonstrated his careful planning and his successful concealment of crimes for 4 years. This was not insanity. This was calculation. Werner himself did not testify. Against his attorney's advice, he remained silent throughout the trial. The only time he showed emotion was when prosecutors displayed the photographs he'd taken. Witnesses reported that Werner appeared not horrified but rather annoyed, as if the prosecutors were mishandling his professional documentation. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and 17 minutes. Guilty on 23 counts of murder, Judge Harrison Thompson sentenced Werner to death by hanging. But in his remarks from the bench, Thompson addressed what he called the larger questions raised by the case. This court has heard testimony that paints a picture not merely of one man's depravity, but of a society that failed its most vulnerable citizens so completely that they became invisible. 23 children died or disappeared, and their absence went largely unnoticed because they were poor. They worked in factories. They lived in overcrowded tenements. When they were gone, the machinery of society simply continued without them. Werner's particular evil was to recognize and exploit this invisibility. He understood that certain children, poor children, immigrant children, could disappear without consequence. This should disturb us far more than the methods of one criminal. This should force us to examine the systems that made such crimes possible. The judge's words proved prescient. Werner's execution was set for April 17, 1903, but the case took one final grotesque turn. On March 29th, prison guards discovered Werner had hanged himself in his cell using strips of fabric torn from his prison uniform. He left no note, no explanation, no confession beyond what the evidence had already revealed. Some saw his suicide as an act of cowardice, escaping the public execution that awaited him, but others noted the timing. Werner killed himself exactly 1 week before the publication of a comprehensive exposé by the Philadelphia Inquirer that would have revealed additional details about his background and methods. It was his final act of control, his final refusal to be completely exposed. The aftermath of the Werner case sent shockwaves through multiple institutions. The Philadelphia Police Department underwent significant reforms. Captain Walsh, the fire department officer who had dismissed the bones discovered during the 1902 fire, resigned in disgrace. Detective Halloran received a commendation but was reportedly haunted by the case for the rest of his career. The identification and return of remains to families proved agonizing. Many of the children had been dismembered and distributed across multiple mounts. Complete identification was impossible in some cases. 15 of the 23 victims were eventually identified through dental records, distinctive bone formations, or healed fractures that parents remembered. 8 remain unidentified to this day. A mass funeral was held on May 3, 1903 at Mount Moriah Cemetery. More than 3,000 people attended. The coffins, some containing complete remains, others containing only fragments, were buried in a section donated by the cemetery's owners. A monument was erected bearing the inscription, "Suffer the little children to come unto me." Werner's building at 847 South Street was demolished in June 1903. The lot remained vacant for 17 years. When construction finally began in 1920, workers reported feeling uneasy on the site. The building that replaced Werner's shop, a pharmacy, experienced unusually high employee turnover. Many workers reported nightmares. In 1964, during renovation work, construction crews discovered a small hidden chamber in what had been Werner's basement. Inside were additional tools, more photographs, and documentation suggesting Werner may have corresponded with other taxidermists about his techniques. These materials were immediately sealed by authorities and remain in restricted archives at the Philadelphia Police Department to this day. Werner's wealthy clients, the society families who had paid him to preserve their pets, faced their own reckoning. At least 37 families came forward to have their preserved animals examined and, if necessary, destroyed. The psychological trauma of learning that one's beloved pet mount might contain a murdered child's remains proved devastating to many. Mrs. Abigail Thornton, whose earlier praise of Werner's work had been published in newspapers, became a recluse after learning that Prince, the dog mount she had kept in her parlor for 2 years, had contained the rib cage of a 7-year-old girl named Maria Benedetti. Thornton never spoke publicly again and died by her own hand in 1907. Broader implications. The Werner case fundamentally changed how America's growing cities dealt with their most vulnerable populations. Within a year of the trial, Pennsylvania passed the Indigent Deceased Protection Act of 1904, requiring detailed documentation of all bodies received for burial or medical purposes. The law mandated that even charity burials must be recorded with the deceased's name, age, and burial location. Other states followed Pennsylvania's lead. By 1910, 32 states had enacted similar legislation. The laws were collectively known as Werner laws, a name that ensured the Philadelphia taxidermist infamy would be permanently attached to child protection legislation. But the case raised darker questions about the value societies place on different lives. Judge Thompson's remarks from the bench, his observation that poor children were invisible, echoed in reform circles for decades. Settlement house workers, progressive-era reformers, and child labor advocates all pointed to the Werner case as evidence of systemic failure. How could 23 children disappear without society noticing? The answer was uncomfortable. Because they were poor, because they were immigrants, because they worked in factories instead of attending school, because when they died, there was no one with power to demand accountability. Jane Addams, the social reformer and founder of Hull House in Chicago, referenced the Werner case in her 1909 book, The Spirit of Youth in the City Streets. The Philadelphia taxidermist did not invent the invisibility of poor children. He merely exploited it. Our cities are full of children whose absence would be noted by their immediate families but would cause no ripple in the larger mechanisms of society. They are functionally invisible. Until we address the systemic poverty and exploitation that creates this invisibility, we will continue to produce monsters who recognize and abuse it. The case also revealed how professional respectability could mask horrific crimes. Werner's educated manner, his European credentials, his immaculate shop, all served as camouflage. Multiple people had encountered evidence of his crimes, but dismissed it because it seemed inconsistent with his presentation. This phenomenon, now recognized in criminology as respectability bias, would appear in other infamous cases. H. Holmes, the murder castle killer, used his status as a physician to disarm suspicion. Ted Bundy's charm and education made witnesses doubt their own concerns. The Werner case provided an early documented example of how monsters hide in plain sight by performing normalcy. The taxidermy profession itself underwent scrutiny. Professional organizations established ethical guidelines and standardized materials requirements. The Society of American Taxidermists, founded in 1880, revised its membership requirements in 1905 to include character references and background investigations. Perhaps most significantly, the Werner case changed public attitudes toward the treatment of the dead. The Victorian and Edwardian obsession with death rituals, the elaborate mourning customs, the desire to preserve and display the dead, came under increasing criticism. The practice of pet taxidermy, while not eliminated, became less popular among educated classes. There was something unseemly, post-Werner, about the desire to preserve death's appearance, while eliminating its substance. The case had revealed the grotesque potential lurking beneath the surface of Victorian death culture. In the decades that followed, similar cases emerged that showed Werner was not unique. In 1921, a mortician in Cleveland was discovered to be selling bodies entrusted to his care. In 1937, a medical examiner in New Orleans was found to have maintained a collection of bodies he'd harvested organs from without permission. In 1989, David Sconce of California was convicted of multiple violations for improperly disposing of bodies at his family's crematorium. Each case involved the same exploitation of vulnerability, the same recognition that some bodies were less protected than others. But none captured public horror, quite like Werner's case, because of its particularly grotesque detail. The transformation of murdered children into decorative objects for wealthy homes. The bodies had not simply been disposed of. They had been repurposed, made to serve the aesthetic desires of the very classes whose economic system had rendered these children vulnerable in the first place. The symbolism was too perfect, too horrifying to ignore. Modern historians studying the Werner case focus on what it reveals about progressive-era America. The stark class divisions, the exploitation of immigrant communities, the failure of institutions to protect the powerless, the willing blindness of privileged citizens to suffering that existed just blocks from their mansions. Werner was a monster, certainly, but he was a monster that a particular social order had made possible. What do you think drove Matthias Werner to commit such unspeakable acts? Was it simply financial desperation, or was there something darker? A fundamental lack of empathy that allowed him to see children as nothing more than materials for his craft? Leave your theories in the comments below. The Werner case reminds us that the most horrifying monsters are often the ones who appear most normal, most respectable, most trustworthy. They operate in the spaces where society isn't looking, among the vulnerable, the poor, the invisible. If you found this deep dive into lost American history as disturbing as I did, subscribe to Fierce Sermon for more forgotten stories of crime, mystery, and horror from our nation's past. Ring that notification bell so you never miss an upload. Next week, we're we're investigating the case of the Akron boarding house murders, a landlady whose guests checked in but never checked out, and what detectives found beneath her basement floor. Until then, stay curious, stay skeptical, and remember, history's darkest chapters are often the ones written in invisible ink. See you in the next video.